How people slept in the Middle Ages. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable, sleep. Or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Segmented sleep, the two-part night. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influences, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was simple. After sundown, most people turned in early, drifting off into what was known as first sleep. Then after about 4 hours, they'd wake up deliberately and spend the next hour or two doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was just how sleep worked. The watch period between the two sleeps was seen as practical, useful, and occasionally alarmingly social. People used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend fires, or check their livestock, because nothing ruins your REM cycle like wondering if your goat is still in the yard. And yes, this was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested and calm of mind during this period, which sounds like a polite way of saying too tired to argue. So if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. The second sleep would follow this interlude, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from monks to farmers participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures like Chaucer casually mentioned it, which means that yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about not sleeping properly. Oddly enough, modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. The two-sleep cycle aligns with how our circadian rhythms work in the absence of artificial light. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era with factories, gas lamps, and the growing fear of unproductivity that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours as though sleep were a timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't failure. It was the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. The medieval bed, straw, lice, and luxury. Let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a sack of rough fabric, if they had the luxury of a sack. If not, it was just straw on the floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat. These pallets were not comfortable, but they were better than nothing, which was the alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and good at insulating against the cold. It was also great at harboring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, which made sleeping and exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit you, just shifted slightly and hoped for the best. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back, they might elevate the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. This didn't change the sleep experience dramatically, but it did reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear, slightly. Linens were a rare treat. Most people slept in the clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't really a thing, and neither was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent, all slept together in the same space, sometimes on the same straw pile. If you got too warm, You could always roll into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Large wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to keep out the drafts and hopefully the lice. These beds were so valuable they were passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place to not freeze, to avoid the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. The nightcap, a hat for freezing. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a cozy little drink, maybe something with whiskey, a warm fire, and a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat, a real, tangible, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much against the cold, and central heating was called a dog. So to keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it was a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But beyond warmth, nightcaps had social weight too. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even while asleep. And the cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or status, because nothing says success like going to bed with a mini flag on your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation." And yes, this hat does mean go away. Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunic. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge minus the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Sharing is caring and unavoidable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal and not at all optional. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room, or a bed, or even a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunk houses than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. This was not considered rude. It was just efficient use of resources. Beds could host 2, 3, even 4 travelers depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to assign beds by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But often it was first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, back then it was an upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Worried about theft, many travelers slept with their purse tied to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their bundles, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with entourages, and camped in relative comfort or demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof. Bedtime prayers, spiritual insurance. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Hence the popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses just in case they died somewhere between good night and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment, from illness, fire, demons, or most dangerously, being over 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers, not because it was comforting, but because hell was terrifying and you didn't want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. One common version: if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole catalog of prayers for different threats, one for when you were feeling guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters, one for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The really devout, monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles, ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, they took a vow of silence, which wasn't hard because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls and in part because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. ## the meaning of dreams. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense, stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in eternal consequences, serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were considered messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were demonic temptations. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention and possibly write it down or confess it or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding them. Dreamt of fire might be hell. Dreamt of water could mean purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish. You'd better call a priest immediately and possibly move. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread? That might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony or just hunger, but still, better to confess it anyway just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and fewer happy endings. The Church, predictably, was suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. Sleeping with livestock, the original heated blanket. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cozy if occasionally smelly arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was a heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating? That was called the family pig. In peasant homes, it wasn't unusual for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes the same bed, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snorted softly beside the hearth, and if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't about affection, though medieval people certainly appreciated their animals. It was about survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, didn't hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat. A chicken might serve as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene? Let's not ask too many questions. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't usually sleep next to livestock, though they might still have lapdogs in bed, not for heat but for fashion and flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favorite animals because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals can be loud, they can wander, and they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m.? Just part of the bedtime routine. The Salem witch trials. Introduction. The winter of 1692. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet kind of fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes and frozen fields. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from Salem town over politics and religion, crops had failed, smallpox had ravaged nearby communities, wars with native tribes had left many traumatized. There was friction between neighbors, inheritance disputes, and a deep resentment toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, and something was bound to break. That break came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave strangely. They screamed uncontrollably, they threw things, they contorted their bodies in unnatural ways. At times, they fell silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, unsure of what to do, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical cause, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word set fire to the fears already simmering in Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. And now, if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, what did that mean for the rest of the community? The girls, prodded by both adults and peers, began naming names. First they accused women on the margins, social misfits and outcasts, but soon the accusations would reach the respectable, the wealthy, even the pious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows and a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history book. The first accusations. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like in Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and claimed they could see dark spirits hovering over certain villages. It wasn't just childhood imagination, it was theatrical, public, and most disturbingly believed. The first to be accused were those with the least protection, women who already lived on the edges of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps. People claimed her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe, she snapped at children, she fit the mold of a witch because she didn't fit the mold of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who defied convention, clearly suspect. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household, was the most exotic of all. Originating from Barbados, her storytelling, accent, and folklore frightened the villagers. Under pressure, possibly even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew it wide open. She told a story of a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through it. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges were disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes turned into spectral assault. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's doing. The fear became so infectious that not even the innocent dared to speak out. To defend an accused witch was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence was safety, and so the web of accusations widened, trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was fading, hysteria was now in control. #the Court of Oyer and Terminer. As accusations mounted and the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phipps, recently appointed and eager to maintain order, established a special court to deal with the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by panic. Instead of requiring hard evidence or reliable witnesses, it allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream choking them, that was admissible in court. Never mind that the accused could be asleep, at church, or miles away. It was their spirit doing the devil's work. You couldn't cross-examine a dream, and worse, you couldn't disprove it. Children were now treated as star witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court became more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. If they didn't look at her, she shrieked louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agony. If you confessed, you might be spared death, but only if you named others. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. Worse still, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from nearby towns to witness them. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, often bewildered, often poor, and almost always powerless. And yet, not everyone believed. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused. But few spoke openly. Questioning the court meant questioning the will of God. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. The story of Fulvia. Introduction: a woman born to command. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite yet slightly eccentric Fulvi family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics. Though not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. She was born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections and treachery were daily news. She would have seen how politics wasn't just played in the forum but in marriages, funerals, rumors, and backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would break all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and connected, and she knew it. While her early life remains hazy in the historical record, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid. This wasn't someone who faded into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and a will to act even in the male-dominated space of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia came of age right in the middle of it. Rather than recoil from chaos, Fulvia would learn to use it. Her early life didn't produce the kind of modest matron Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical player in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power, she would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. First marriage: Publius Clodius Pulcher. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Claius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Claius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Claius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, scandalous behavior that only seemed to raise his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate. Claius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, was right there beside him. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political world. She engaged with his supporters, was visible during his campaigns, and managed their household as a hub for clay politics. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But the alliance came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Claeus was murdered on the Ion Way by the bodyguards of his political rival Titus Annus Milo. His death sent shock waves through Rome, but Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Claeus's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, bloodied wounds exposed for maximum effect. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had turned personal grief into public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it worked. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as strategy, and wield her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Claeus was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadow, and Rome would never see her the same way again. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression and another aching to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm, it was the law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant, lynching still occurred, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs and high-press fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington wasn't born out of a single conversation. It was the result of rising frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most: the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been floating around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order. But now in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it despite their many disagreements because they understood the power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized, flyers were spreading, word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers, and across the country Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. The planning, orchestrating a moment. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was no small feat, but planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was madness. Logistically, it sounded like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans. And yet, somehow they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept behind the scenes for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin had once studied nonviolence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled by the FBI, but nothing fazed him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed the idea into a reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby, hospitals in D.C. were put on alert, and liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home. And then there was the question of unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, NAACP, CPS, SNCC, SCC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics. Some wanted more radical action, others more diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach. But they all agreed on this: the time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked, every speaker was timed to the minute, every route had marshals trained in crowd control. They weren't just planning a march, they were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country they came: black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best, others clutched protest signs. They came by bus, train, carpool, and even foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic, the Red Cross handed out water, groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of "Jobs and Freedom" echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autograph. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't just a protest, it was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the Mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to say "we are here," in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone, it was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideologies, and regions but united in message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history, it was becoming legend, minute by minute. The speech, "I have a dream." By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before, but what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, "the Negro is still not free." His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence not as fillers but as instrument. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin! Tell them about the dream!" And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he'd delivered before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Applause, tears, shouts of joy. They knew they had just witnessed something more than ortrai. They had heard prophecy. The faces in the crowd. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music. It was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steel workers, postal clerks, who saw themselves not as political figures but as witnesses. They didn't just want change, they were the change. There were also children in the crowd, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speaker voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event, it was the beginning of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, (SNCC). His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won out. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity, freedom now, buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold, they were shaping it. And none of them would ever forget what they saw. True economic justice of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human right. But they do so in a world transformed by social media surveillance and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion, it was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared lived reality.